Well, I just want to say congratulations to you all. You've made it to the fourth and final episode, the Florida History Show. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. Now, this is the last season, and it's my favorite. The title of this season 4 is South Florida Booms, Hurricanes, and World War II, 1926 to 1990. So watch this and make sure you take notes for your recollection. You likely won't hear some of these stories anyplace else in the world. Thanks again for watching the Florida History Show. Now onward to the years 1926 to 1990. When we left off, I was talking about the hurricane of 1926, right? And I was talking about how the water came over Miami Beach and pretty much wiped out everything that Tuttle, Merrick, Fisher, and Brickell had all built. And it was all gone, right? It was 1926. Amazingly, just 2 years after that, almost to the day, another hurricane of equal size hit Palm Beach and dumped tons of water into Lake Okeechobee. The loss of life was estimated at between 1,800 and 2,000 people. The reason they don't know the exact number, and it's only estimated, is because most people who died were black laborers working around Lake Okeechobee. Now, it's only estimated that it was 2,000 because the bodies of many of those who have known to have lived there at the time were never found. The newspapers called it the Big Blow of 1928, and this is what the headline looked like. Now look at this picture. Look at the car. It devastated everything inland from Palm Beach all the way west to Lake Okeechobee. Since 1992, August 24th exactly of 1992, most of us in my age range believe that Hurricane Andrew was the worst storm ever to hit Florida. It was Hurricane Andrew. Andrew slammed into South Dade, killing just 18 people, but leaving 250,000 people homeless. Now, why was that disparity so different than in 1926 when thousands of people died? First, we knew it was coming, so everyone was much better prepared for it. Also, the houses not destroyed by Andrew weren't destroyed because they were fortified, and the building codes had been progressively getting better throughout the entire 20th century. But the reason so many were left homeless is that by 1992, there were so many more homes in South Florida, unlike 1926 and 1928. But Andrew was not the most powerful storm of the century. There have been 4 Category 5 storms to make landfall in the continental United States. 3 of the worst storms to hit North America have landed here in Florida. Hurricane Michael enters the record books as the 4th strongest U.S. hurricane. It had 161 miles an hour of sustained winds. Those of you from Panama City and the rest of the Panhandle, you know about Hurricane Michael. There are some parts of Panama City that still haven't recovered from it several years later. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 had sustained winds of 166 miles an hour when it slammed in to Homestead and Cutler Ridge. And then there was Hurricane Camille, which walloped Mississippi in 1969 and packed sustained winds of 173 miles an hour. But none of those 3 were the strongest storm. That distinction is reserved for the hurricane of Labor Day 1935. It hit the unsuspecting Middle Keys around Isla Mirada and then rode up the Gulf Coast towards Tampa. According to the National Hurricane Center, the strongest hurricane ever recorded, with winds of over 200 miles an hour, was the storm that hit the Keys on Labor Day, 1935. The strongest storm ever to hit was in the Keys, Labor Day, 1935. Now, I want to explain the difference of why it was so powerful. You know, they always talk about sustained winds, right? How much sustained winds a storm had. Well, then they say there are gusts. Well, the gust is what does the damage. I mean, if you think about it, it's the punch of a gust that does the damage, knocks over things. Sustained winds just push by incredibly unfortunate coincidence. At that time, the Roosevelt administration, and we're talking 1935, the Roosevelt administration had sent 680 workers from the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, to work on 3 camps down on the Keys on Windley Key and Matacumbe Key. Now, they were doing road work for the CCC and developing new bridges down there. Well, they were living in tents while they were doing their work. So, not knowing the strength of the storm and not knowing what was coming, a rescue train was sent down to the Keys bound for those camps to rescue those guys. Well, the train never made it. Not only were the camps not rescued, but including the men on the rescue train, 408 folks lost their lives from that single hurricane, the most powerful hurricane ever to hit Florida. Now, I want you to look at this picture. And I want you to look at it closely because this picture shows the train blown off the tracks. And that's what I always thought when I saw this picture. I thought, how much wind, how much punch was there to knock that train off the tracks? Well, then I found out that it wasn't actually blown off the track. It was lifted off the track by storm surge. Thus, the #1 cause of death was drowning. Imagine seeing all that, the wall of water coming right at you, and those train tracks were just off the water line. And so it did devastating damage to those people from the Civilian Conservation Corps and to the guys who were doing all the work and living down there in those tents. How many of your grandparents or great-grandparents, that's men and women, were veterans of World War II? Well, my dad was. He was in the Marines, and this was his hat. That's right, my dad was in the 6th Marine Division, the 22nd Regiment of the 6th Marine Division. He was a private first class, and this was actually his uniform. Florida sent 250,000 of her best young men to that war. 250,000 Floridians fought in World War II, and it changed Florida forever. 40 military installations were built, and Florida was the prime training ground in the United States. During World War II, Florida was the prime training ground in the United States. It was just, the whole state was just one big training camp. Every hotel was filled with trainees, including all the luxury hotels on Miami Beach and St. Pete Beach. And this picture is of South Beach on Miami Beach, looking south. Where the trees are now hotels. But there they were on the beach, training and doing calisthenics. Well, during the war, Florida was a very busy place. We grew to have 172 military installations, 172 military installations. Imagine that, in one state. Almost immediately after war was declared, welders and shipbuilders poured into Florida and our ports, and they were abuzz with cargo ships. In fact, Florida is one of the few states where the war came to our doorstep. Hardly any other state was in that position where we actually saw a piece of the war. Here's what happened. Because unbeknownst to us at the time, in early 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, the Germans had launched Operation Drumbeat, a very big deal for the Kriegsmarine. Operation Drumbeat was Germany's first military attack against the United States, and it happened to happen right here in Florida. They did it with submarines in groups of 8 that they called wolf packs. See, the U-boats would go after merchant ships with cargoes bound for England and the Pacific. It was a really target-rich environment because we had so many cargo ships leaving our ports heading for England and the Pacific. For the residents of Brevard County, that's Titusville, Cocoa Beach, Melbourne, any illusion that the war was remote was quickly broken, because on February the 13th, that's February the 13th, 1942, just 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, German U-boat number 128 had entered the congested shipping lanes just 20 miles off of Brevard County at Cape Canaveral and torpedoed U.S. tanker Pan, Massachusetts. Well, all they had to do was wait for merchant ships to come out of our ports. They didn't even have to go very far into the Atlantic. Well, the U.S. Pan, Massachusetts was carrying fuel. The ship's cargo of gasoline and oil exploded into towering flames just 20 miles off the coast. When you see something like that, with cargo that explosive, 20 miles offshore, it makes a big impression. Towering flames easily seen from the coast. It woke up and frightened thousands of coastal Floridians who had no idea that Drumbeat was even going on. 24 ships were sunk in Florida waters in February of 1942 alone. 24 ships. It was German wolf packs against defenseless tankers all day long, up and down the coast, all the way from New York to Miami. And destroyers with depth charges chasing the submarines by day. And it went on during the entire war. That's the game of cat and mouse that they played. I want you to think about those 24 merchant ships, which were all sunk in the year 42. In that single year, hundreds of good, brave merchant marines drowned from those attacks from submarines on our merchant ships. Most of those guys were Florida citizens. And they were unsuspecting because they weren't even in the Navy. They were merchant marines doing their best to get cargo where it was supposed to go. So I always felt bad about those guys. One well-witnessed sinking involved these guys. I want you to pay attention to this picture for just a second. This is Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan, shown here in the center of his conning tower bridge, and he's flanked there by his first and second watch officers, whose name were Rudolf Hoffman, that's him on the left, and Horst van Schroeder on the right. Captain Reinhard Hartigan is in the middle. This picture was taken while their U-boat was in operation just off the coast of Florida from January to August in 1942. Now, I want you to look at his hat and all the hats in this picture. You notice the captain is wearing this hat. This is an exact copy of what captains of U-boats would wear in 1942. And this hat took me a long time to acquire because it's very rare. You see, if you were wearing this cap and you were in Germany in a port like maybe Bremerhaven, you would be a rock star because at the beginning of the war, U-boat commanders were the most famous prizes in the Navy. And only U-boat commanders would wear this cap by the end of the war. But by the end of the war, there were very, very few guys wearing these hats. And that is because most U-boats and their crews did not survive the war. Well, here's what happened with their U-boat, U-123, with Hartigan in command. Is anybody here from Jacksonville? Fletcher High School, perhaps? Well, Fletcher High School is right on the coast. It's just a block off the coast. And the amusement park during the 1940s had Ferris wheels and all kinds of rides. So on the weekends, it was a very popular place to be. And on this particular night, April the 10th, 1942, the amusement park could see the water very easily. And at Jacksonville Beach, on the night of April 10th, 1942, patrons of that amusement park were shocked with the sight and sound of a violent red explosion just 4 miles off the coast. Where were the merchant ships coming from that day? Mayport Naval Station, just across from Fletcher High School. And it's a sacred place because of this incident. Now, the amusement park isn't there anymore, but just across the street from Fletcher High School is where you could see that violent explosion on the water. It was a huge fireball which lit up the sky. It was our USS Gulf America, and Hartigan and U-123 had nailed her with 2 torpedoes. But the Gulf America refused to sink. And so, as the people on shore gasped, U-123 surfaced and fired its surface gun at the tanker's waterline to try to make sure that it sank. The Gulf America finally did sink, and U-123 slithered back into the deep, and the residents of Jacksonville Beach were scared enough to be whipped up into a frenzy. And everybody in that amusement park saw the whole thing. And they presumed, after seeing the submarine, that an attack on their beach was imminent. So you can imagine that the calamity that it must have caused. They thought they were going to be attacked. The Jacksonville Beach was going to war right now. Everybody went home and started packing. And so they put up these barriers along the shoreline, all up and down Florida's coast, and up north as well into the Carolinas. But of course, an attack on shore never did come. But the people on shore could clearly see the submarine as it was silhouetted in front of the burning tanker, because the submarine surfaced between the shore and the tanker. So the flames created a silhouette that everyone could see of U-123. Well, Captain Reinhard Hartigan, commander of 123, had heard the screams from ashore. And he realized that he had given them a pretty good show, in his opinion. He wrote in his log and in his final report of the sinking, quote, "A burning tanker, artillery fire, and a silhouette of a U-boat on the water. Never before has that been seen in America," end quote. He was really proud. He and his crew were all proud. All of Germany was proud of them. They were one of the best. Well, for the Germans specifically, They were one of the best U-boats on the water. And that was the only sighting of a U-boat from a shore anywhere in America. And it was witnessed by all of those folks who went to Fletcher High School and lived in Jacksonville Beach in February of 1942, especially if you were in that amusement park. Well, all three of these guys, by the way, Hartigan, von Schroeder, and Hoffman, survived the war. Mostly because they were taken out of service and brought home as heroes and paraded around Germany as the best that the Kriegsmarine had to offer, and they did a lot of recruiting. Hartigan died just recently, actually. As a matter of fact, he died in 2018, which is pretty recent. He was 105 years old when he died. And so there's lots of history on him, and he told lots of stories, and he spent a lot of years recounting his days as one of the most famous U-boat commanders of all time. Hoffman and von Schroeder both rose to the rank of vice admiral after the war and became part of NATO forces. While all that was going on outside of our ports, young men all over Florida were learning how to fly. Some became famous, like Jimmy Doolittle and his Raiders, who eventually bombed Tokyo later in '42. Florida trained thousands of pilots during the war, thousands. But sadly, over 700 trainees died in training accidents over the skies of Florida. Think about that for a second. That 700 people died learning how to fly. And it was a little bit like it was no big deal. We lost another plane today, we lost another pilot, but 700 is a lot of people to die while you're training. And think about this. More pilots were killed in Florida training accidents than the 507 British pilots who were lost in the Battle of Britain. Let me say that again. More pilots were killed in Florida training accidents than the 507 British pilots who were lost in the Battle of Britain. And here's a huge number, and it just gives you an idea of how many people were training and learning how to fly planes. Crisscrossing all over from different bases, learning how to fly all different kinds of planes. Well, I have a true story to tell you about these guys, and I'm not making this up. This really happened. During the war, Florida skies were filled with planes like these P-39s out of Fort Myers. Everywhere you looked, there were planes every day, mostly practicing close formation flying. This is a true story. This really happened. Out of Opelika, the Navy was flying TBF torpedo bombers. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Midway, and I recommend you do, the second movie, not the original, the plane that is featured at Midway in the movie are TBF torpedo bombers. Well, that's what they were learning to fly out of Opelika. And the pilot, we had a pilot, and then we had a crewman, gunner, who was facing towards the back, facing the tail. Pilot facing front, gunner facing the tail. Well, one day in 1943, while flying in formation, the propeller of one TBF torpedo bomber accidentally cut off the tail of the plane ahead of it. It might sound extraordinary, but it happened all the time. Well, the pilot of the stricken plane yelled into his microphone, which happened to be on transmission instead of intercom. So instead of talking to his gunner, who was facing the other way, he was talking to the entire squadron. And he said, "Pilot to crew, bail out." And 108 crewmen dove out of their planes for no particular reason and prayed that their parachutes would open. Almost all of them landed, and almost all of them were recovered and survived. But they bailed out of their planes because one pilot was pressing transmission instead of intercom. How embarrassing is that? How would you like to have been the squadron commander on that day? And that's an absolutely true story. 108 guys bailing out of their planes. Well, in North Florida, in North Central Florida, for those of you from Stark, Camp Blanding, which is right near Stark, Florida, was by far the most crowded installation in Florida, Camp Blanding. And it kept building up all throughout the war. At its peak, 90,000 enlistees made Camp Blanding the fourth largest city in Florida during the war. And after the war, hundreds of thousands of troops would be discharged in our camps, primarily Camp Blanding. So for some of those boys and their wives and their sweethearts, they would decide that they would like to live in Florida. They liked Florida pretty well after being down here some during the war. And the winters were great, and so they decided they'd stay. Some of those guys who trained in Florida at the very beginning of the war liked it so much that they came back right after the war. So, armed with the GI Bill and guaranteed low-interest mortgages, which my father had, and my father was able to go to college on the GI Bill when he probably never would have been able to, all because of the GI Bill, the GI Bill of Rights. Veterans and their families in overwhelming numbers moved to Florida right after the war. And what do you suppose happened to the population? That's right, it doubled again in just 10 years after the war. And so began the longest continued growth spurt of anywhere in the United States history. Our population has increased over 1,100% since 1946. By far the most growth of anywhere in America. And we have had to deal with it. So we went from 1.8 million people in 1946 to 21.4 million just a couple of years ago, with a growth rate of 15% since most of you were born. And it's still growing. 900 people to 1,000 people per day. That's unheard of in world population circles. So, where'd they all come from? Well, mostly our increase in population has come from the northern U.S., it's come from Latin America, and also 30 other countries around the world. Now, there's one last gentleman that I want you to meet, a really famous governor, and then we will conclude. He was Governor Leroy Collins, and he was governor from 1955 to 1961, and he was famous nationwide. Governor Collins represented values such as hard work, honesty, business promotion, social harmony, and governmental reform. His first years as governor directly followed the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1954, ending racial segregation and integrating our schools. Well, Collins, unlike other Southern governors, adopted a very moderate stance and condemned defying the court order, the only Southern governor to do so. Upon his death in 1991, he appeared on the front page of Time magazine, the front cover. of Time magazine. A very rare achievement for a governor at the time. And the Florida House of Representatives unanimously named Leroy Collins Floridian of the Century, a well-deserved honor indeed. This last map I want to show you is a reference to where people live in our state. And it continues to change every year because those red areas that you see on this map are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Each dot represents 1,000 people. So there are two things that stand out in this map that I want you to pay attention to. Number one is, where does the population live generally? It lives on the coast, just like the population has always lived on the coast, which is why the Seminoles were kicked out of their homes because they were too close to the coast. And people coming from the north needed to live on the coast. So that's why the Seminoles were kicked out of that space. And so 90% of Florida's population still lives along the coastline. 90% live within 15 miles of water. Now, that's no real surprise, isn't it? Actually, why not? And it's always been that way. But look at the concentration in the South, which is the other thing I want you to see. Today, a clear majority of Floridians live south of Orlando. And that is really the story of Florida for the last 200 years. Remember that around 1830, there was really nothing south of Greater Orlando, nothing south of Middle Florida. Nothing. No villages, no settlements, no permanent structures, no trails of any kind. And for all practical purposes, there really wasn't anything developed until 1900. Remember that Miami wasn't even incorporated until 1905, the same year that Oklahoma became a state. Now, look at South Florida again. 1 in 3 Floridians, as we have learned before, live between Palm Beach and Miami. 1 in 3 Floridians live between Palm Beach and Miami in those 3 counties. A third of the state lives in that little area, which didn't even exist 100 years ago. By the year 2045, and you can calculate how old you all will be in 2045, Florida will blow past a population of 30 million. Right now, we have just shy of 22, 23 million. We are going to have to manage that growth, just like we always have, especially that growth spurt in the 20th century. We're going to have to manage our growth. And that is the single biggest issue facing Florida: growth management. That is what you're going to be dealing with. Where to expand, where to put new shopping centers, where to put new schools. All of that to be planned out very carefully. And so, what's next for Florida? What do you suppose is going to happen to the population? Well, that's right. It's going to double again. And visitors too, of course, with our beautiful beaches and our exciting theme parks. Florida is secure as one of Earth's most coveted tourist destinations. Everyone in the world wants to come to Florida. Every time I travel overseas, they're amazed that I actually live in Florida because they've always wanted to come here. And they will eventually. And just like Flagler taught us, hospitality is our #1 industry. Florida needs your leadership, ladies and gentlemen. You must continue to manage our growth. And I'll make you one more bet, that Cuba will become very important to Florida again, especially Havana. I think Havana eventually and Miami will grow up in this next century as twin cities. Havana will be a big part of Florida's future, just like it has been for the last 500 years. And when that happens, the business, social, and cultural possibilities are nearly endless for Florida, especially South Florida. Havana will again become the Hong Kong of the Caribbean, I think. And Miami and Havana will build themselves a future as twin cities. And again, what do you suppose is going to happen to the population? That's right, it'll double. So we do have the oldest state in the country and the oldest recorded history, as I said when I first got up here. But it's also the youngest state, isn't it? The oldest state and the youngest state at the same time, especially where most of the people live, which is south of Orlando. What an incredible contrast for the last 500 years. From St. Augustine in 1565 to Miami, not incorporated until 1905, from the oldest to the youngest. This concludes the Florida History Show. And so I want to say thank you for sticking with me for all 4 seasons of the show. And if you haven't seen the others, please consider checking them out and then coming back to this point. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your patience. It's really been fun for me. This concludes the Florida History Show. And now, go out there and be a great Floridian.